Imagine, for a moment, that you are getting married. You think of the person you love, the shared future you envision, the family you might build. It is a decision born of affection, of mutual respect, a deeply personal and human choice. Now, erase that picture entirely. Instead, imagine your marriage is not a choice, but a calculation. Your spouse is not a partner, but a strategic asset, selected from a shallow pool of your own close relatives. Your uncles are also your brothers-in-law, your nieces are your potential wives, and your family tree has ceased to be a branching symbol of life, instead curling back on itself, a tightening knot of genetic repetition. For generations, this was not a grotesque hypothetical. It was the statecraft of the most powerful family in Europe, the House of Habsburg. And in the late 17th century, this meticulous, centuries-long project of self-preservation produced its final, horrifying result. A king so broken by his own bloodline that he was a living testament to its decay. His name was Charles II of Spain, and he was a man whose body was a battlefield, a grotesque canvas upon which the sins of his fathers were painted in excruciating detail. What happens when the pursuit of power ignores the fundamental laws of biology? The answer lay in the sputtering, drooling, seizure-racked monarch who could not chew his own food without choking, a king who ruled a global empire but could not control his own lolling tongue. The tragedy of Charles II began not at his birth, but 200 years earlier, with a strategic decision that would define an empire and doom a bloodline. The Habsburgs, rulers of a sprawling collection of territories from Austria to Spain to the New World, faced a perennial problem of the powerful: how to keep it all. Their solution was deceptively simple and ruthlessly effective: marry each other. Instead of diluting their power and lands by marrying into other royal houses, they consolidated it. They practiced a policy of systematic, strategic inbreeding, turning their own family into a closed system. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The goal was to preserve the integrity of the Habsburg inheritance, ensuring that their vast domains remained under the control of a single house. For a time, it worked spectacularly. This policy created a continental superpower and forged a dynasty whose influence was felt across the globe. But nature keeps its own ledgers, and the accounts were coming due. The most visible sign of this genetic bottleneck was the infamous Habsburg jaw, a severe case of mandibular prognathism, where the lower jaw grows so much larger than the upper that the teeth cannot meet. What began as a mild family trait, a distinctive feature seen as a mark of noble blood, became progressively more pronounced with each generation, evolving from a symbol of distinction into a badge of deformity. This was the system into which Charles was destined to be born, a system where the health of the individual was sacrificed for the perceived health of the dynasty. His parents were the epitome of this policy. His father, King Philip IV of Spain, was 54 years old when Charles was born. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was not only his wife but also his niece. She was the daughter of Philip's own sister. This made Charles not only Philip's son but also his grandnephew. The genetic entanglement was staggering. Of Charles's 8 great-grandparents, 6 were descended from a single couple, Joanna and Philip I of Castile. His family tree was less a tree and more a tangled, withered shrub. Modern geneticists have calculated what the Spanish court of the 1660s could only sense with superstitious dread. The inbreeding coefficient measures the probability that an individual will inherit 2 identical gene variants because of shared ancestry. For the average person in a healthy, diverse population, this number is close to 0. The child of a first-cousin marriage has a coefficient of 6.25%. A child born of an incestuous pairing between a brother and a sister would have a coefficient of 25%. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient was 25.4%. He was, genetically speaking, his own first cousin, born from the equivalent of an incestuous union. The architects of the Habsburg dynasty, in their quest to create the perfect political heir, had inadvertently created a perfect storm of genetic disease. From the moment he drew his first ragged breath on November 6, 1661, Charles was a source of profound anxiety. He was a fragile, sickly infant, his survival so uncertain that the foreign ambassadors in Madrid were already placing bets on his demise and scheming over the division of the Spanish Empire. His body was a catalogue of ailments. He suffered from fevers, constant diarrhea, convulsions, and rashes. He was so frail that he did not walk until he was nearly 8 years old, often carried everywhere on a cushion like a porcelain doll. His speech was delayed even longer, and when he finally did talk, his voice was weak and lisping, hampered by his enormous tongue and the misshapen jaw that left his mouth perpetually agape, a stream of saliva often trickling down his chin. His head was unusually large for his small, emaciated frame, a condition likely caused by hydrocephalus or water on the brain. This accumulation of fluid would have put constant pressure on his developing mind, contributing to the profound learning difficulties that plagued his entire life. He was given almost no formal education, partly because his tutors despaired of his ability to learn, and partly because any mental exertion seemed to threaten his fragile health. He remained functionally illiterate and innumerate, a king who could barely sign his own name to the decrees that governed millions. As he grew into adolescence, the full horror of his genetic inheritance became cruelly apparent. The Habsburg jaw in Charles reached its grotesque apex. His mandible was so profoundly overgrown that his upper and lower teeth were in different zip codes. They could not meet to bite, let alone chew. Every meal was an ordeal. Food had to be mashed or pre-chewed for him, and he often swallowed his food whole, leading to agonizing indigestion and frequent choking fits. His appearance was unsettling. The long, narrow face, the bulbous lower lip, the pale, almost translucent skin, and the vacant, melancholic eyes gave him the look of a perpetual invalid. Courtiers whispered behind their hands, and foreign dignitaries sent back chilling descriptions of the spectre on the Spanish throne. Yet, the superstitious court of 17th-century Spain had a different diagnosis. They did not see the predictable outcome of generations of inbreeding. They saw witchcraft. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. It was easier, more comforting, to believe that their king was the victim of a demonic curse than to accept the terrifying truth that the royal bloodline itself was poisoned. This belief condemned Charles to another layer of suffering. Instead of receiving what little effective medical care the era could offer, he was subjected to the tortures of the exorcist. Priests performed elaborate, terrifying rituals, waving crucifixes and chanting incantations over the terrified young king, trying to expel a demon that existed only in the twisted helixes of his DNA. He was forced to drink holy water, to wear blessed amulets, and to endure endless prayers, all while his body continued its slow, inexorable collapse. He ascended to the throne in 1665, a 4-year-old child king in a realm teetering on the brink of ruin. His mother, Mariana, ruled as regent, a fierce and politically ruthless woman determined to protect her son's inheritance. But the court was a viper's nest of factions, with nobles and ministers constantly jockeying for power, using the weak king as a pawn in their elaborate games. Charles was a phantom at the center of his own government, a living symbol whose sole political function was to exist. His survival, however tenuous, was the only thing preventing the Spanish Empire from being carved up by its voracious neighbors, particularly the France of King Louis XIV. The entire political stability of Europe rested on the frail shoulders of this one boy, and as he entered manhood, the pressure shifted from mere survival to a far more daunting task: procreation. The dynasty that had been built on a succession of strategic wombs now depended entirely on his. He had to marry, and he had to produce an heir. It was a duty for which his broken body and tormented mind were catastrophically unprepared. The great tragic climax of Charles's life was not a single event, but a prolonged, decade-long public spectacle of sexual failure and profound human humiliation. The first sacrifice to the altar of dynastic continuity was a French princess, Marie-Louise d'Orléans. She was young, vibrant, and by all accounts, beautiful. As the niece of the French King Louis XIV, she was a prize, and her marriage to Charles was meant to seal a fragile peace between the two rival powers. When she was told of her fate, she reportedly sobbed, "Do not make me a queen." Her journey to Spain was a descent into a different world. She left the glittering, lively court of Versailles for the suffocating, somber piety of the Spanish Escorial. The courtiers were dressed in black, their faces grim masks of rigid etiquette. And then she met her husband. One can only imagine the shock, the private horror that the young princess must have felt upon first seeing the gaunt, drooling figure to whom she was now bound for life. Yet, by all accounts, she treated him with a kindness and pity that bordered on affection. Charles, in turn, became deeply infatuated with her. He loved her with a desperate, childlike intensity, the only flicker of genuine warmth in his bleak existence. Their wedding night, and every night that followed, was a matter of state security. The future of the empire depended on what happened behind the closed doors of the royal bedchamber. But in the Spanish court, no doors were truly closed. Courtiers were tasked with listening for any sounds of consummation. The state of the royal bedsheets was examined each morning for evidence of success, the results whispered through the corridors of the palace. It was a ritual of public humiliation, and at its center were a terrified, impotent king and his deeply unhappy child bride. The historical records, though veiled in the delicate language of the era, paint a grim picture. Charles was likely sterile, a consequence of his genetic disorders. Furthermore, he was reported to suffer from premature ejaculation, a condition that would have made conception impossible even if he had been fertile. Day after day, month after month, year after year, the kingdom waited for news of a pregnancy that would never come. The pressure on the young couple was immense. Marie-Louise sank into a deep depression, finding solace in food and riding. She grew stout, her youthful beauty fading under the weight of her gilded captivity. For Charles, the failure was a source of profound personal agony and public shame. He was failing in his one essential duty as a king, and he knew it. In 1689, after 10 years of this miserable marriage, Marie-Louise fell ill with severe abdominal pain. Within days, she was dead at the age of 26. The official cause was likely appendicitis or a related infection, but rumors of poison swirled as they always did in such courts. Others said she simply died of a broken heart. On her deathbed, she is said to have looked at a portrait of herself from her happier days in France and whispered to the weeping Charles, "I was beautiful once." Her death devastated him. He retreated into a profound grief, but the state could not afford him the luxury of mourning. The vultures were circling. An heir was more critical than ever. The search for a new queen began almost immediately. This time, the choice was purely clinical. The Spanish court selected Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess whose family was renowned for its remarkable fertility. Her mother had given birth to 23 children. She was chosen not for her beauty or her political connections, but for her promising womb. She was seen as a walking cure for the king's affliction. Maria Anna was a different creature from her predecessor. She was ambitious, politically astute, and keenly aware of the power that a royal pregnancy would grant her. The grim cycle began anew. The public expectation, the scrutiny of the bedchamber, the endless prayers for a miracle. But the result was the same. The royal marriage remained barren. Faced with the prospect of losing her influence should Charles die heirless, Maria Anna resorted to a desperate and cruel deception. On multiple occasions, she faked pregnancies. She would announce that she was with child, sending the court and the country into a frenzy of celebration. Bells would ring, special masses would be held, and the kingdom would rejoice at its salvation. Maria Anna would mimic the symptoms of pregnancy, confining herself to her chambers and accepting the congratulations of the court. But as the months dragged on with no visible signs of a growing belly, the ruse would inevitably collapse. The public joy would curdle into confusion, then suspicion, and finally, bitter disappointment. This grotesque pantomime of hope played out more than once, turning the sacred process of royal succession into a tragic farce. For Charles, each phantom pregnancy was another turn of the screw, another public advertisement of his own inadequacy. He submitted to endless, humiliating examinations by court physicians who offered bizarre and useless remedies, while his wife's schemes only magnified his failure on an international stage. As the 1690s drew to a close, Charles's body began its final catastrophic failure. At an age when most men are in their prime, he was a decrepit old man. His health, always precarious, completely deserted him. He was racked by debilitating seizures that left him unconscious for hours. His hair had fallen out, his teeth had rotted away, and he was nearly blind. He became increasingly senile, prone to fits of rage and bouts of weeping. He suffered from dropsy, his legs and abdomen swelling with fluid, making it difficult to walk or even breathe. He was a king in name only, a ghost haunting his own palace, while outside his chamber, the great powers of Europe sharpened their knives, preparing to feast on the corpse of his empire. In the autumn of 1900, just shy of his 39th birthday, the end finally came. After weeks of agony, Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, died. But his body had one final horrifying story to tell. The royal physicians, who had spent decades fruitlessly poking and prodding the living king, were now granted their ultimate wish, to open him up and find the source of his curse. The autopsy was performed immediately, and the official report is one of the most chilling documents in the annals of medical history. It is a clinical, unsparing account of total systemic collapse. The surgeon, Dr. Cristobal Alvarez, reported that the king's body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart, he wrote, was the size of a peppercorn, a shriveled, atrophied muscle. His lungs were corroded, his intestines were putrefied and gangrenous, and his kidneys were diseased. Then came the most damning discoveries. The physician found that the king possessed only a single testicle, and it was, in the doctor's words, black as coal, shrunken and necrotic. This single grim observation explained a decade of public humiliation and dynastic failure. The final, shocking finding was in his head, which was found to be full of water. The hydrocephalus suspected in his childhood was confirmed. The fluid-filled skull, explaining a lifetime of cognitive impairment and seizures. The autopsy was not the discovery of a curse, it was the clinical confirmation of a genetic catastrophe. It was the bill for 2 centuries of dynastic arrogance, presented in the form of rotten viscera and atrophied organs. Even in death, Charles could not escape the morbid traditions of his family. Before his own interment, he had insisted on visiting the Panteón de los Reyes, the royal crypt beneath the monastery of El Escorial. There, in the damp, cold dark, he ordered the coffins of his ancestors to be opened. He gazed upon the desiccated, leathery remains of his father, his mother, and his great-grandfather. Finally, he stood before the casket of his first, beloved wife, Marie-Louise d'Orléans. When the lid was lifted, he stared down at the decayed body of the woman he had loved and failed. Overwhelmed with grief and horror, he reportedly collapsed, crying out her name. A few months later, his own body, embalmed and encased in a lead coffin, was brought down to that same crypt to join the ghastly family reunion. The bewitched king was laid to rest among the very people whose ambition had created him, his corpse a final, silent testament to the ruinous end of their line. His death was not an end to the suffering, but a beginning. He died without a designated heir, leaving the throne of the largest empire on earth vacant. His will named a French prince, Philip of Anjou, the grandson of his arch-rival Louis XIV, as his successor. The other powers of Europe, particularly the Austrian Habsburgs, refused to accept this. The result was exactly what the inbreeding was designed to prevent. In 1701, Europe plunged into the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal 13-year conflict that engulfed the continent, redrew the map of Europe, and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The legacy of Charles II is one of profound and devastating irony. The Habsburg obsession with keeping power and territory within the family, the very policy that demanded the constant marrying of close relatives, directly led to the genetic collapse that extinguished their Spanish line and triggered the catastrophic war they had sought to avoid. They had sacrificed the health of their children on the altar of the state, only to have that state torn apart as a direct consequence. The system had consumed itself. The label El Hechizado also served a crucial political purpose. By blaming Charles's condition on black magic and demonic influence, the court and the church deflected responsibility from the true culprit, the dynasty itself. It was far more palatable to believe that the king was a victim of a supernatural evil than to admit that the royal house had, through its own deliberate policy, bred itself into a state of decrepitude. The curse was not external, it was carried in the royal blood itself, passed down from one incestuous generation to the next. Modern science has provided the final damning post-mortem. An analysis of the Habsburg dynasty confirmed the devastating effects of their marital practices. Researchers found that the inbreeding coefficient increased dramatically over generations, culminating in the genetic nightmare that was Charles II. His litany of ailments can now be diagnosed with chilling precision. His skeletal deformities, infertility, and short stature were likely caused by at least two distinct genetic disorders: combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which stunts growth, and distal renal tubular acidosis, a form of kidney failure that can lead to rickets. The Habsburg jaw, the seizures, the hydrocephaloceac symptom can be traced back to recessive genes, which are far more likely to express themselves when close relatives reproduce. Charles was not bewitched. He was the victim of a predictable, avoidable, and entirely man-made biological disaster. His suffering was not a mystery, it was an inevitability, written into his genetic code by the hands of his own ancestors. We return then to where we began. We look at the sanitized portraits of Charles II, the official images that did their best to soften the protruding jaw, to lend a noble air to the vacant eyes, to conceal the horrifying reality of the man himself. These paintings are propaganda, an attempt to project an image of power and legitimacy that the king's own body refuted with every ragged breath. The true portrait of Charles is not found on canvas, but in the grim report of his autopsy surgeon and the tragic accounts of his short, painful life. He was not a monster, nor was he merely a fool. He was a human being condemned from conception to a life of physical agony and psychological torment, all in the service of a political idea. His body was a prison, and his crown was a curse. It is easy to look back across 3 centuries and see the story of Charles II as a bizarre historical artifact, a Gothic tale of a half-mad king from a superstitious age. But to do so is to miss the terrifyingly modern lesson at its core. The Habsburg dynasty was a closed system. It valued purity, the purity of its bloodline and its inheritance above all else. It refused to look outward, choosing instead to turn inward, to fold in on itself until it became unsustainable and self-destructive. Charles II is the ultimate symbol of what happens when any system, be it political, ideological, or social, becomes a closed loop. When an ideology refuses to tolerate dissent, when a society fears outside influence, when a culture values purity over diversity and adaptation, it begins to sicken. It becomes brittle, weak, and ultimately it collapses under the weight of its own rigid self-regard. Charles was a human sacrifice, offered up to the god of dynastic ambition. His body was a ledger, and every seizure, every pain, every humiliation was an entry, tallying the horrific price of power pursued to its own ruinous end. His life stands as a grotesque and eternal warning. When we twist the laws of nature to serve the designs of humanity, nature will eventually present a bill that cannot be ignored, and its payment is often rendered in flesh and blood.